Chapter 2 of The A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. The A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces by Heywood Broun. Chapter 2 The A.E.F. The dawn was gray, and so was the ship, but the eye picked her out of the mist because of the two broad yellow stripes which ran the whole length of the upper decks. As the ship warped into the pier, the stripes of yellow became so many layers of men in khaki, each motionless and each gazing toward the land. "Say," cried a voice across the diminishing strip of water, "what place is this, anyhow?" The reply came back from newspapermen, whose only companions on the pier were two French soldiers and a little group of German prisoners. "Well," said the voice from the ship, "this ought to be better than the Texas border." The American regulars had come to France. The two French soldiers looked at the men on the transport and cheered, flinging their caps in the air. The Germans just looked. They were engaged in moving rails, and after lifting one they would pause and gaze into space for many minutes until the guards told them to get to work again. But now the guards were so interested that the Germans prolonged the rest interval and stared at the ship. News that ships were in was carried through the town and people came running to the pier. There were women and children and old men and a few soldiers. Nobody had known the Americans were coming. Even the mayor was surprised and had to run home to get his red sash and his high hat. Children on the way to school did not go further than the quay, for back of the ship, creeping into the slip, were other ships with troops and torpedo boat destroyers and a cruiser. Just before the gangplank was lowered, the band on the first transport played the Star-Spangled Banner. The men on the ship stood at attention. The crowds on shore only watched. They did not know our national anthem yet. Next the band played the Marseillaise, and the hats of the crowd came off. As the last note died away, one of the Americans relaxed from attention and leaned over the rail towards a small group of newspapermen from America. "Do they allow enlisted men to drink in the saloons in this town?" he asked. Somebody else wanted to know, "Is there any place where a fellow can get a piece of pie?" A sailor was anxious to rent a bicycle or a horse and "ride somewhere." Later the universal question became, "Don't any of these people speak American?" The men were hustled off the ship and marched into the long street which runs parallel with the docks. They passed within a few feet of the Germans. There was less than the length of a bayonet between them, but the doughboys did credit for their brief training. They kept their eyes straight ahead. "How do they look?" one of the newspapermen asked a German sergeant in the group of prisoners. "Oh, they look all right," he said professionally, "but you can't tell yet. I want to see them in action first. They don't lift their knees high enough," he added, and grinned at his little joke. A French soldier came up then and expostulated. He said that we must not talk to the Germans, and set his prisoners back to their task of lifting rails. There were guards at both ends of the street, but scores of children slipped by them and began to talk to the soldiers. There were hardly half a dozen men in the first regiment who understood French. Veterans of the Mexican border tried a little bad Spanish, and when that didn't work they fell back to signs. The French made an effort to meet the visitors halfway. I saw a boy extend his reader to a soldier and explain that a fearfully homely picture which looked like a caterpillar was a chenille. The boy added that the chenille was so ugly that it was without doubt German and no good. Children also pointed out familiar objects in their books such as chats and chines, but as one soldier said, "I don't care about those things, sonny. Haven't you got a roast chicken or an apple pie in that book?" Some officers tried to teach their men a little French on the trip across, but not much seemed to stick. The men were not over curious as to this strange language. One old sergeant went to his lieutenant and said, "You know, sir, I've served in China and the Philippines and Cuba. I've been up against this foreign language proposition before, and I know just what I need. If you'll write down a few words for me and tell me how they're pronounced, I won't have to bother you any more. I want, 'Give me a plate of ham and eggs,' 'How much?' 'What's your name?' and 'Do you love me, kid?'" The vocabulary of the officers did not seem very much more extensive than that of the men. While the troops were disembarking, officers were striving to get supplies started for the camp several miles outside the city. All the American motor trucks had been shipped on the slowest steamer of the convoy, but the French came to our aid. "I have just one order," said the French officer who met the first unit of the American Expeditionary Army. "There is no American and no French now. They are only ours." Although the officer was kind enough to make ownership of all available motor trucks common, he could not do as much for the language of the poilus who drove them. I found the American motor truck chief hopelessly entangled. "Have you enough gasoline to go to the camp and back?" he inquired of the driver of the first came on to be loaded. The Frenchman shrugged his shoulders to indicate that he did not comprehend. The officer smiled tolerantly and spoke with gentle firmness, as if to a wayward child. "Have you enough gasoline?" he said. Again the Frenchman's shoulders went up. "Have you enough gasoline?" repeated the officer, only this time he spoke loudly and fiercely, as if talking to his wife. Even yet the Frenchman did not understand. Inspiration came to the American officer. Suddenly he gesticulated with both hands and began to imitate George Beban as the French waiter in one of the old Weber and Fields shows. "Have you enough gasoline?" he piped mincingly. Then an interpreter came. After several companies had disembarked, the march to camp began, up the main street and along the fine shore road which skirts the bay. The band struck up "Stars and Stripes Forever," and away they went. They did not march well, these half-green companies, who had rolled about the seas so long, but they held the eyes of all and the hearts of some. They glorified even cheap tunes such as "If You Don't Like Your Uncle Sammy, Go Back to Your Home Across the Sea." And Sousa seemed a very fine master of fire when the men paraded to his marches. These American units did not give the impression of compactness which one gets from Frenchmen on the march. The longer stride gives the doughboy an uneven gait. He looks like a man walking across a plowed field, and yet you cannot miss a sense of power. You feel that he will get there even if his goal is the red sun itself at the back of the hills. There was a long-drawn cheer from the people who lined the streets to see the Americans pass. Even crowds in Paris do not cheer like that. Instead, individuals called out phrases of greeting, and there was much hand-clapping. Although mixed in point of service, the men ran to type as far as build went. They amazed the French by their height, although some of the organizations which followed the First Division are better physically. Of course, these American troops are actually taller than the French, and in addition, they are thin enough to accentuate their height. It was easy to pick out the youngsters, most of whom found their packs a little heavy. They would stand up straighter, though, when an old sergeant moved alongside and growled a word or two. It was easy to see that these sergeants were of the old army. They were all lank men, boiled red from within and without. They had put deserts and jungles underfoot, and no distance would seem impossible for them along the good roads of France. As ship after ship came in, more troops marched to camp. The streets were filled with the clatter of the big boots of doughboys throughout the morning and well into the afternoon. There were American army mules, too, and although the natives had seen the animal before in French service, he attracted no end of attention. In his own particular army the mule seems more picturesque. He has never learned French. It seems to break his spirit, but he pranced and kicked and played the very devil under the stimulus of the loud endearments of the American mule drivers. The French were also interested in a company of American negroes especially recruited for stevedore service. The negroes had been outfitted with old cavalry overcoats of a period shortly after the Civil War. They wore blue coats with gold buttons, and the lining was a tasteful but hardly somber shade of crimson. Nor were the negroes without picturesque qualities, even when they had shed their coats and gone to work. Their working shirts of white were inked all over with pious sentences calculated to last through the submarine zone. But piety was mixed. One big negro, for instance, had written upon his shirt, "The Lord is my shepherd," but underneath he had drawn a large starfish for luck. A few daring ones had ornamented themselves with skulls and crossbones. To the negroes fell the bitterest disappointment of the Americans' landing in France. Two Savannah stevedores caught sight of a black soldier in the French uniform and rushed up to exchange greetings. The Senegalese shrugged his shoulders and turned away from the flood of English. "That," said one of the American darkies, "is the most ignorantest and stuck-up nigger I ever did see." They were not yet ready to believe that the negro race had let itself in for the amazing complications of a foreign language. Later in the day the town was full of the eddies which occur when two languages meet head on, for almost all the soldiers and sailors received leave to come to town. They wanted beer and champagne and cognac, chocolate cake, crackers, pears, apples, cherries, picture postcards, sardines, rings, cigarettes, and books of French and English phrases. The phrase books were usually an afterthought, so commerce was conducted with difficulty. A few of the shopkeepers equipped themselves with dictionaries, and painstakingly worked out the proper reply for each customer. Signs were much more effective, and when it came to purchase, the sailor or soldier simply held out a handful of American money, and the storekeeper took a little. To the credit of the shopkeepers of the nameless port, let it be said that they seemed in every case to take no more than an approximation of the right amount. Fortunately, the late unpleasantness at Babel was not absolutely thoroughgoing, and there are words in French which offer no great difficulty to the American. The entente cordiale is furthered by words such as chocolat, sandwich, beer, and beefsteak. The difficulties of vin are not insurmountable either. "A funny people," was the comment of one doughboy. "When I asked for sardines, I got 'em all right, but when I say cheese or canned peaches, I don't get anything." Another complained, "I don't understand these people at all. They spell some of their words all right, but they haven't got the sense to say 'em that way." He could see no reason why vin should be pronounced like vin. Another objection of the invading army was that the townsfolk demanded whole sentences of French. Mixtures seemed incomprehensible to them, and the officer who kept crying out, "Madame, where are my oeufs?" got no satisfaction whatever. Late in the afternoon phrase books began to appear, but they did not help a great deal, because by the time the right phrase had been found, some fellow who only used sign language had slipped in ahead of the student. Then, too, some of the books seemed hardly adapted for present conditions. One officer was distinctly annoyed because the first sentence he found in a chapter headed War Terms was, "Where is the grandstand?" But the book which seemed to fall furthest short of promise was a pamphlet entitled, "Just the French You Want to Know." "Look at this," said an indignant owner. "Le travail est sur la santé et le bien-être. Il élève y forte l'âme. Il adoucit les souffrances. Chasse l'ennui et plaisir sans péril. Il est en cœur le seul des autres plaisirs." Go on with it. Look at what it means. Work assures health and well-being. It elevates and fortifies the soul, drives away ennui, alleviates suffering, and, a pleasure without an equal, it is still the salt of all other pleasures. What do you think of that? Just the French you want to know. I don't want to address the graduating class. I want to tell the barber to leave it long on top, but trim it pretty close around the edges. The happy purchaser of the book did not throw it away, however, until he turned to the chapter headed "At the Tailor's," and found that the first sentence set down in French meant, "The bodice is too tight in front, and it is uncomfortable under the arms. It is a little too low-necked, and the sleeves are not wide enough." Sundown sent most of the soldiers scurrying back to camp, but the port lacked no life that night, for sailors came ashore in increasing numbers, and American officers were everywhere. The two hotels, the Grand and the Grand Hotel des Messageries, known to the army as the Grand and Miserable Hotel, were thronged. Generals and admirals rushed about to conferences, and in the middle of all the confusion a young second lieutenant sat at the piano in the parlor of the Grand and played Schumann's Warum over and over again as if his heart would break for homesickness. The sailors and a few soldiers who seemed to have business in town had no trouble in making themselves at home. "Mademoiselle, donnez-moi un baiser, s'il vous plaît," said one of the apt pupils to the pretty barmaid at the Café du Centre. But she said, "Mais non." Crowds began to collect just off the main street. I hurried over to one group of soldiers, convinced that something important was going on, since French soldiers and civilians stood about 6 deep. History was being made indeed. For the first time, craps was being played on French soil. End of chapter 2.